Hi everybody, we're going to take a look at the document object model today. You can find the demo project here on this replit right here. Our objectives: we want to understand the document object model. We want to access page elements by their ID. We want to change the contents of elements, get the contents of input elements, and add elements to a page. Vocabulary, we've only got a couple we're going to focus on today: the document object model itself and forms. So let's get into it. When a page loads, it's got all of these parts to it, right? The basic structure has an HTML element. Inside that, there's a head element that contains a title and a meta charset. And then there's the body element that has whatever content you've got. Maybe it's a header, maybe a nav bar, maybe it's got a bunch of divs, some articles, all of those things. When the page loads, JavaScript pulls that into an object model with a hierarchy, and things are children of the other elements that they're inside. Works really well. So for example, I've got HTML like this. We've got the doc type declaration, we've got our HTML, it's got a head and a body. Inside the body for this one, I've got a header, I've got a nav that contains one single link, and I've got an article that has a heading, an image, and a paragraph. So here's what the document object model would look like for this. I've got the HTML, and there's a document object that I didn't create a particular piece for, but we've got the HTML object. It has a head and a body. The head has that meta charset object, a link to a style sheet, and a title. And then that body has a header, a nav, and an article. The nav has an A. The article has an H1, an image, and a paragraph. So that's the way this tree sort of forms, and you can add things to it and you can access things from within it. And part of it is that those objects all come with a fantastic set of properties that help you out. So the contained text would be in the inner HTML property. Any attribute you've added to it is available to you. An ID, a class, custom attributes, whatever you've set, the href or the source for an A or an image, the ID of an element, list of classes, the styles that are associated with it in respect to CSS, and you can access child and parent objects through that object tree. So the document object model gives us really good programming control over the things on our page. So to get an element, the most direct way is to get it by its ID. If I have this in HTML, a header with an ID of page header, I can grab it into a variable like this. I do document, remember that's that parent object of everything else in the page. Document dot get element by ID. Notice the camel case capitalization in there. Document dot get element by ID, and then in parentheses and quotes I put the ID that I'm looking for. Notice that that matches that. Okay, so that's the expression that gets the object, and then I put it into a variable like this: var page header equals all of that. Now I can change that header. So we stored it in a variable called page header, and so now I want to change its contents. So I say page header dot inner HTML equals, and then whatever string I want it to be. I can use, again, any expression that results in a string. So it can be a function call, it can be a variable, or it can be a literal, like this one. I can change its background color. In this case, I set it to black. I can add a class to it so that it'll be styled differently based on where it sits in the CSS. So maybe I'm going to add a user header class to it. I can remove a class. If I can do a class list dot remove admin header. So now I've taken it out of the admin header and put it into the user header class. Okay, all kinds of things are possible. Much, much more. Anything that you want that has to do with it, you can probably get access to it. Quick little Google search will find it, or you can always ask. It's just a matter of finding the right property and the right value. Let's talk about getting input from the user. So let's talk about forms. HTML forms are how web pages most typically get input from a user, and then they're often used to submit that input to a page. It's not quite how we're going to do it in this case, but that's a fairly typical use of forms. And then there are many types of inputs available. For our purposes, we're going to focus on the text input. It's super flexible and it's a great place to start. I would like you to take a moment right now. Look up form elements, write a bunch of them down in your notes, and save the link. I want you to see what kinds of things are possible. There's a pretty good bet that if you want to get the information from the user, probably somebody has come up with an element for it. Moving on now, we're going to talk about text boxes. So text boxes are an input that allows the user to enter text. You can get that out in JavaScript with the value property. It has this placeholder attribute. You can see this over here. Placeholder equals name of fruit. And notice that that shows up here and it's kind of gray. That's that thing where it shows when the text box is empty. Once the user clicks into it, it disappears so the user can type. So it's a great way to provide a prompt to a user without taking up any extra space on your page. I want to talk about this idea of a name versus an ID on a form input element. If you're submitting a form to another page, that page is going to use the name attribute as the way to access it, right? As opposed to the ID. If you're working in JavaScript, we get elements typically by their ID. So to stay steady with that, that's what we're going to do. So I haven't even put a name on this one. It's not a bad idea to use the same name as ID for those inputs. Makes it nice and simple. And notice that a text box is an empty element. It has no closing tag. It doesn't come with contents. If you wanted to set it to a default value, you would add an attribute of value equals, and then whatever you wanted that default value to be. Let's talk about naming conventions now. You'll notice here that I have called this one txt fruit. Okay, I want to explain that a little bit. I like to prefix my inputs with an abbreviation of the type. So this is a text box, so I do it with txt, and then whatever it's going to represent. There are label elements that help provide some clarity, and there are some cool things you can do with labels. They're especially good for people who are using a screen reader, because the screen reader will say the name of the label, will say what the label says when somebody goes into that input. So I would prefix those with LBL, and that lets you have the same name for two elements of different types. So maybe I've got a label and a text box for fruit. So I might have one be LBL fruit and one be TXT fruit. Works very well. I also recommend using the same variable names as the ID of the elements. That helps provide clarity in your code. So, getting the input, you want to get the element. So we do that right here. TXT fruit equals document.getElement by ID TXT fruit. We access the value property to get whatever the user typed in. Var fruit name equals txt fruit.value. So if they typed in New York City, that would now be in the variable fruit name. And then we can use that variable in any way that we would normally use a variable, alert fruit name. Try that out yourself. Go into your own Replit, the practice for this one, or whatever you're using if you're not using Replit, though everybody in this class should be, and try it out. Create an input element, have something, a button that'll run a function, and grab it like this and put the get the value out of it and alert whatever the result is. Just because we've asked for a fruit doesn't mean that's what our user is going to give us. All right, creating elements now. To create a new element, we use this create element command. So I say document.createElement, and in here I've got the tag name of the element that I want to create. In this case, it's a list item, because I'm going to add this fruit to a list of fruits. And then var li fruit, I'm going to have the variable name be li fruit. So at the end of this, I've got an li, a list item, has nothing in it, no text, no ID, nothing. but it's sitting there in li fruit. So now I can modify it just like we did before. And I can say lifruit.innerHTML equals fruit name. This is the variable we used when we created that element. And this is the variable we used when we got the value out of the text box before. Okay? So that takes that value, puts it into the inner HTML of that list item that we created on the previous slide. And then we need to add the element to the page. So we grab the parent out of it. So I've got a list item, or a list, an unordered list, called LST fruits. So I say var LST fruits equals document.getElementById LST fruits. So that grabs that list, which at the start is empty, and it puts it into this variable. And then I'm going to use the append child to add the new element. That's the ID of the parent element. Okay? And we'll see that the variable I used to store it before becomes the variable that I use append child on here. Okay? So I'm taking li fruit, which I created in the previous slide. I'm grabbing LST fruits out of my page and appending li fruit as a child to it. It's all very confusing, right? Remember those key things. We create the element. We set its value, its inner HTML to whatever we want it to be. We get its parent, and we append the new element to that parent. Here's the final results. I have a page that has an input box there. I've typed kiwi into. Now it's pomegranate. I click the save button, which runs this function on the left, and that adds it to our list. So our user can add as many fruits to the list as they want. Okay. Again, this demo is available in the Replit.